I'm going to start off with posing a question to each of our speakers, and then I'll open to the floor. So, to Sean first. Should the distinction between humanitarian funding and development funding be abandoned? And if so, what should replace it? So a nice easy one to start with.
No. So I'll elaborate a little bit on that. I believe some donors are abandoning this distinction. So I believe Denmark, for example, is very much moving towards this. For us, we think we're always going to have a need for distinct streams. What we're doing is building a little bit of flexibility at the edges. So development funding can be sort of reallocated towards a humanitarian aim if there's a spike in conflict or whatever. But for us, I think there's always going to be a need for distinct humanitarian funding. You know, basically the distinctiveness of humanitarian action requires that there be a distinct funding stream, because there's always going to be situations where the government is part of the problem, and you can't work through established structures where by doing that you will exacerbate inequalities. And we see, I suppose, even in mature democracies, you know, you have debates about the allocation of funds in humanitarian crises. We see at the moment in the US, you know, is Puerto Rico getting less than Texas or whatever it is? And definitely in conflict situations, this is even more difficult. So yeah, for us, definitely needs to be a distinction that remains, but a bit more cohesiveness between the two streams.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sean. So, your point there about the requiring different funding models, particularly when we have where the host government is actually part of the problem, is another probably heart to the issue here between humanitarian and development nexus. We can maybe pick up on that in a moment. So, thank you very much. To Helen, another easy question. Can funding mechanisms, the way we think, shift to recognise the diversity within humanitarian actors today and acknowledge that the diversity and complementarity are the best way to ensure better protection and assistance for people in the future?
Well, thank you. Yeah. I hope they can. But my fear is we're actually seeing it go in the opposite direction, in fact. And one of the one of the buzzwords that we were quite happy came out of the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul last year was ecosystem. So we pushed to get that word in. And when we had the head of OCHA, Stephen O'Brien himself, talking about an ecosystem, we felt that we'd won a small battle there. Because it is an ecosystem, and it's and the ecosystem is vast. It's organizations such as you, it's UN organizations, it's municipalities, governments, it's the private sector. I mean, hugely. Again, the private sector has a massive role to play, and notably local companies, small and medium-sized enterprises and so on. So it really is an ecosystem. And I get very worried when I hear all the discussion around the reform of the system. Yes, there are many things that need to change. Yes, the setup that we have today is not necessarily always very fit for purpose. Donors are under increasing scrutiny from their own publics. I mean, I'm now since 2 weeks in the UK. I mean, it's brutal. The attacks that DFID is facing in particular, because they've also managed to maintain this commitment of 0.7% while making cuts in health and in education and so on. So it's really tough for them. But having a one-size-fits-all approach to this is not the right way, and I think that's the risk that we're seeing, and I think that's where it's really important to be able to, for groups like this, and for us to be able to make that distinction of the need to have this ecosystem working together. Of course, it's more complicated when you're a donor to deal with something that's sort of as nebulous as an ecosystem. But it is important in terms of being able to provide the right response. And I think I liked very much the point that you made, saying that external control is not necessarily the solution, but we're seeing more a greater push for external control. So there's a balance that needs to be made in terms of being accountable to taxpayers and demanding transparency. We need to improve on our transparency, I think, as a sector. But then on the other hand, being able to ensure that this diversity is maintained, and it'll get even greater. Notably, with the funding issue being what it is, and the need to find new ways of funding and new actors coming in. So whether they can, I hope. Your question was whether it can. I think it has to. Yeah, it has to.
Super. Thank you very much, Helen. So these are these questions we can pick up on them again, and I'll throw them to the floor now in a moment. Thank you, Helen. And Simone, the program participants don't think in silos. How can programming be adapted to work in accordance with the need rather than funding cycles? And if I can ask you to maybe emphasize on the gender and protection issues.
Okay. I think in order to be a bit more adaptable, definitely it's welcome more flexible funding, so ability to move, and length of project. We are still, at least for as an NGO, working project by project and often year by year, while a program approach will definitely help quite a lot. But I suppose not only the humanitarian funding needs to be flexible, I suppose also the development funding could be flexible as well and accommodate, I can't remember how European Union defined it, the disruptor. So having a pot of money that you can use at any time in case there is an emergency. I suppose also needs assessment coming from our research. They should go a bit beyond the basic needs and recognizing that people are not goats. I thought it was a brilliant quote. And also, as I think you mentioned, Ellen, there's too much a focus on controlling, and I think we should be allowed to fail and experiment a bit more. And lastly, I think it's important to look at the capacity of communities. Like we need to acknowledge that they're human beings and they have skills and resources, so we need to build a bit more on them and give a bit more trust.
Super. Thank you very much for that, Simone.